For the introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Let's see if this works. Yes, it does. Perfect. So, thanks to Piero's introduction, I can be very brief on the first few slides. So, often firms are under a tremendous pressure to price near cost, and so collusion can emerge. And this is why competition authorities have among their goals, as Tommaso was saying, that of monitoring the risk of collusion. So this monitoring activity takes place through leniency programs, the signaling from buyers and suppliers of suspicious cases, and something that we call screening test. So starting with Tommaso's presentation this afternoon, you have started to hear this terminology, but nobody has defined it. So for those of you who are not familiar with the meaning screening test, what do we mean? We mean statistical tests to try to identify competition problems concerning cartels. So also, what are cartels exactly? Well, here as an economist and not a lawyer, I typically tend to have a very broad view of a cartel as any form of agreement between firms to fix prices. So fortunately, at least in the context of Europe, the legal definition of what we can call cartel is very broad, because under Article 101 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which is the article that defines how cartels are persecuted, every form of agreement between undertakings, decisions by associations of undertakings, and concerted practices are all deemed illegal under this article of the European Union. So this very broad set of forms of agreement between firms are prosecuted. And what you have, the figure that you have in this slide, is the initial portion of the flowchart that is reported in the European guidelines where all the set of laws concerning collusion are described. And then the flowchart is very big and describes how the analysis of a collusion cartel takes place. And in this initial portion, as you can see, you see that the origin of the case is either from complaints or ex officio, and then there is an initial assessment with an investigation, and then if there is sufficient evidence, then an investigation, a proceeding starts. So screening tests can help in this initial phase. They can help to point the attention of the competition authority to a certain market, and they can also help to form initial evidence, which will not be typically sufficient to go to court and to close this investigation, but might form also an element, a component of the overall set of evidences that then will be used to form the judgment. So what I want to do in this brief presentation is to give you an overview of this area of the economic analysis, of this analysis of and the construction, development of screening tests. And what I try to do is, time is very short, not to enter into the detail of any one of these tests. Some of them are very complex, some of them are fairly easy, but more to try to give you a broad picture so that you can think and have a reference of where this test belongs and the different kind of data you might need to implement them. So the biggest subdivision you can do is between structural test and behavioral test. And both have been mentioned in the earlier presentation. By structural test, I mean to look for the presence in a certain market, in a certain industry, of structural features that make collusion easier. And I will give you examples. For behavioral test, I will speak about tests that look for suspicious behavior regarding choices taken or outcomes produced by these choices. And then I will further subdivide this behavioral test into price versus quantity, into low probability events versus departure from control group, and to specific tests for bidding markets. So this is the plan of the next 20 minutes. So let's start. Sorry. Sorry. So I woke up whoever was sleeping with that. So let's start first by just very briefly summarizing things that have been already said why auctions and procurement, this is a procurement conference, are such a good target for this kind of tax. First, bid rigging, which is collusion in auction market, is often called bid rigging, is commonly observed in many markets. Half, more or less, of the cases investigated by DOJ regarding collusion take place in bidding market, and they involve an incredibly broad set of markets, from oil, leases, to online auctions, to various aspects of public procurement. And in the context of the EU public procurement sector, we have already seen this number that floats around 15%, although if you try to look at the numbers and reconstruct from the individual data, Mihai was saying, and go up, in Italy you don't go higher than 7%. So there is a big issue in how exactly we measure, but let's say 15%. There is a lack of complaints from public buyer, because we have discussed this extensively. And there is also lack of complaint from, or actually lack of leniency option, because in many countries, Italy included, collusion between firms that participate in a public tender is a criminal act, and so no leniency applies. And there is a growing availability of data despite the problems, although hopefully things will get better, because in the procurement directive, this 24/2013, there is the provision for electronic procurement to grow, so hopefully over the years things will get better, and also there is cross-border procurement, which increases the incentive of the European Union to monitor these things. So let's start now with an analysis of the kind of tests that exist. First, structural test, so features in the environment. The typical red flags that the literature points to regard 4 aspects: limited and known set of firms, standardization of the good, transparency, and predictable demand. Let's see an example. This is probably the most well-known example. So Porter and Zona, 1993, in their analysis of collusion in roadwork contracts, so public procurement in the United States of contracts to maintenance of highways, they list 6 reasons why collusion is extremely likely to take place in this environment. And they say, first, bids are evaluated only along the price dimension, so product differentiation is extremely limited. Second, firms are relatively homogeneous because they use similar technology and inputs. Third, every year there are many auctions and they take place quite regularly, predictable demand. Bidders are experienced at coordinating their actions because joint bidding, which is also this temporary association, temporary joint ventures, co-bidding, is allowed. The same firms repeatedly interact because they participate in many auctions together. And finally, the auctioneer discloses the identity of bids and bidders. We have discussed this morning, transparency. So they listed those as reasons, and indeed, in their study, they were finding collusion. In general, my view is that within the context of procurement auctions, one has to look for environments so that have products that are characterized by low differentiation, firms that are relatively homogeneous and repeatedly interacting, and procurement formats that have features that might be helpful to sustain collusion. So for instance, pre-bidding strategy, joint bidding, being legal, restricted list of qualified bidders, use of third parties guarantees, like in the US performance bond, issued by a very limited set of firms, lot splitting. In the awarding stage, as we will discuss, this average bid or endogenous allocation rules, price-only criterion, and so on. And in the post-awarding stage, subcontracting or any other form of resell, even though it doesn't have the legal name of subcontracting. And so when typically features from all the 3 elements, products, firms, and procurement formats are present, these are environments where you can have a high likelihood of detecting a cartel. So given that there are constraints, and as Tommaso was saying, in the activity of Chief Economist team or DG Comp, there are constraints to the number of cases and markets they can study. It's important to have something that can direct the attention. Now, behavioral test. So looking for suspicious behavior. This division of price versus quantity test has been proposed by Joe Harrington, and I will just report you what Harrington says. So here, for those of you familiar with this word, this graph, you might have seen it hundreds of times. But This is a very famous and very simple example to show you what price tests are. So in this world of behavioral test, you can look at price feature or quantity feature. In terms of price feature, for a series of reasons that now we don't have time to discuss, but it's known that cartels have a tendency to reduce the variance of prices relative to the variance of cost in the same industry. And also, as it is obvious, there will be a tendency where there is a cartel present for having a high mean, because that's exactly the activity of a cartel, keeping price high. Moreover, in terms of quantity, there will be a tendency to have greater stability in the market shares relative to a competitive market, and there will be a tendency for negative correlation in fair market share over time. As Alberto was suggesting, this bid rotation, for instance, is a typical feature that would produce this feature. So one example of the price test, you have it in this graph. This is the famous example of the frozen perch public procurement purchase in the US military. So the military was buying frozen perches, fish, to supply its own military. On the bottom of the graph, you have cost of this thing. So the raw input, the fish. And the on the higher line, you see the price. And you have these vertical bars. The first bar tells you the beginning of an antitrust investigation in collusion in this market. And then the second bar tells you about the end of the investigation, which ended with a conviction of the firms in this market. And what you can see are two things here. The price test features. That is, first, high mean. Relative to the post-investigation form, the average price is much higher than in the pre-investigation. And second, and crucially, the variance. In the pre-investigation, the variance of the final price is much lower than what you see afterwards, and especially if you confront with the variance of the cost at the bottom, you see that the cost tends to vary much more than the price. And again, there is no time to go into the details, but oh my goodness, it's gone.
Maybe you have to go there.
Okay. Very entertaining presentation. So, anyway, so if you were to apply this test, what do you need? If you want to apply the price test, you need prices, and that you can calculate, and no? I have to stay here. Okay. I wanted to point something in this graph, but not. So, this is an example of an application done in the US. By the FTC to see whether they can use this test to point their attention to some.
Just the pointer.
No? Oh, yes, it does. Okay. So whether they could use this, this test to identify some markets where to point their attention. Well, okay. Does it work? Yes, it does. Okay. Where they could point their attention, and so they calculate the standard deviation, so a measure of the variance, the price of gasoline across 279 gas stations in Kentucky, and the mean price, essentially what you want to see if there is something in this corner. So that has a high mean and a low variance. And they concluded in this example, in this application, that there was nothing in this corner, and indeed they check afterwards whether they found any element of collusion, and there was not. So as you can see, this is a kind of test that is fairly easy to apply. You don't need much data, despite Mihai before was explaining that oftentimes the data in procurement are not so rich. Price data is something that often is present. Much harder, the quantity test. I was mentioning at the beginning of this part, you need to calculate market shares to assess stability of market shares. But then this is much harder because in the context of procurement, it's typically very hard to reconstruct the full market share of the firm active in these markets. If you can, then you can have very useful and simple machinery, and I will show you an example in which not the overall market share, but the market share within one specific auction, but it was a crucial important auction given the size, has been important to determine the risk of potential collusion. And in this investigation by the Italian Competition Authority, it ended up with spotting collusion. And price test, we have said basically everything. One thing that is interesting, and I will come back to this, is that the Swiss Competition Authority has recently won a case in front of the Swiss court in which they had started the investigation of a collusion in the, again, road repairing sector in Switzerland, that they had started from a screening test based purely on prices. And I will get back to this. Now, other subdivision of the behavioral test is between low probability events and tests that look at departures from a control group. So low probability events, what is a low probability event? You can guess. It's something that is very unlikely to happen. Now, these, depending on the markets, depending on the data, can take a huge number of forms. So this is just an example. Again, this is a well-known example that some of you probably have already seen, but this is the outcome of the auction that Germany in 1999 held to sell GSM licenses. And that was an auction divided into 10 lots. These lots were asymmetric. The 10th was larger, and all the first 9 were of equal size. There were all the German mobile phone operators that participated in this auction to get one or more of these licenses. And what happened is a phenomenon called jump bidding. So in the very first round, this was an auction that was supposed to last for many, many rounds, and over time the firms were supposed to increase their bids across the various slots. In the very first round, Mannesmann made very high bids. They could have started with $1 million. Instead of bidding $1 million, they bid at 36.36 million in the first 5 lots. And then in the last lots, they bid at 40 million. Then in the second round, T-Mobile, the competitor, understood, or likely, this is an ex-post interpretation, but what happened in the second round is that T-Mobile bidded only in the first 5 and did not bid in the last 5. So in the first 5, T-Mobile bid just above 40.01 and did not bid anything. Mannesmann kept his bid at 40 million, and then by the third round, the auction had closed with a price way lower than what it was expected. Essentially, through this jump bidding, they managed to reveal Mannesmann most likely was able to show to T-Mobile, I'm interested in the last 5 lots, don't bother me there, you can get the first 4, and T-Mobile was smart enough to understand. So this is just an unlikely event, and so it's a signal that probably something happened. Now, you can construct many more. In Mihai's slide, there was something called Benford law that is sometimes applied, and there are many more. So in the interest of brevity, let me go on, but that's also an interesting area. Now, more involved, but more interesting, also from a scientific point of view, are these tests about the construction of a benchmark, a counterfactual. So the easiest situation is when you have a similar but competitive market. So you are interested in a certain market that can be a certain geographical area, a certain time, a certain procurement institution like a first prize auction, and then you have something you can compare to. A different geographical area, a different time period, same market, but maybe under a different auction format, like a second prize auction, and you can benchmark. And then, by comparing, this can give you, can inform you, can give you a signal about the likelihood of competition problems. This sometimes is not the case. You cannot have this benchmark naturally occurring, or if you have them, you cannot rely on their comparability. Maybe one market goes under the first prize because it has intrinsically some characteristics that make it very different from the second prize, and so they cannot be compared. So the ideal situation is one where, for instance, there is some random assignment, some change in the regulation that creates these differences. When you're not so lucky to have something like this, then you have to rely more on theory, to make more assumptions and to come up
with a theoretical benchmark. And so there are many ways to do this. For people in the audience that are familiar with the merger analysis, this is similar to what a merger simulation is. So you come up with a model of what should happen if this merger takes place, and through this model and through the data that exists on pre-merger, you simulate what would happen post-merger through the lens of this model. And so in an example that one can apply in the setting of procurement, for instance, if the market is posted price, we can come up with a formula that links the price to some characteristics we can observe. For instance, if we have already estimated demand, and then we can calculate price as a function of marginal cost and strategic markup, and then we can simulate alternative market arrangement, more competitive or less competitive, and benchmark the observed price to these polar cases. So again, these are more complex. They would take time to be explained, but this is done in merger analysis, so it is successfully done, both in Europe and in the US, and can be done also in this context. Clearly, they should be handled with a lot of care, because they entail both statistical and economic behavioral assumption. And if these assumptions are not satisfied, then what you get out is not very reliable. Now, the last subdivision of this behavioral test is specific to bidding markets. And here we can think of two further subdivisions. Division by the number of tests that work for different number of auctions. One single auction or multiple auctions, and by auction formats. So in terms of division by number of auctions, this is the typical case whenever we are doing the last type of test. So tests that construct a theoretical benchmark and then do a simulation. They typically, to empirically implement that kind of test, you need a multiplicity of auctions. There are a bunch of papers. One very famous is this by Arianye, but you need typically many, many auctions because you need to estimate a complex model. And so you need to rely on a lot of data to have a good assessment of the parameters of this model. If you don't have all this data, sometimes you can be lucky and you can do a lot, even with a single auction event, if the single auction event at least has either multiple lots within the auction or multiple rounds of the same auction. So here, as promised before, the case from Italy, the recent case from the Italian competition authorities that applied tests to understand whether collusion was likely in a certain market, and then indeed they found it. So what happened? This is Italian competition authority case I-785, Consip school cleaning. So there was a public call for tenders that opened on July 11, 2012. The overall auction had a reserve price of 1.6 billion, which is fairly big for this kind of service, as you can imagine, and it was divided into 13 lots for geographical areas, with a maximum of 3 lots per each firm. The criterion to award each of the lot was the most economically advantageous tender, so it was weighting both the price offered and the series of technical characteristics of the offer. So here you have a table summarizing for 10 of these lots what was the reserve price, and then what happened in terms of participation and discount offered by 2 firms, CNS and Manut & Coop. And if you look at this table, you can already spot that something not so standard happened, in the sense that there is, apart from 2 cases in which they overlap, they are participating, their participation patterns shows what you would likely call a market split. They're not participating in the same auction together, in the same lots together, and when they're participating together, CNS offer a discount that is substantially lower, still very high, more than 30%, but substantially lower than what it offers in the other cases. So this is indeed the kind of data inspection, very simple data inspection, but in this case, the auction was so important, 1.6 billion, that for this company was key to participate and win, that their participation, their lack of competition was quite surprising. And these firms also had some ownership, a complex ownership, joint ownership structure. This led to an investigation. In the investigation, it was found that there were agreements to exchange subcontract that had been signed before the auction. It was emails exchanges were found documenting agreements between various players, and also there was a lack of plausible explanation that was offered by these firms for why they were participating in such a way and making that kind of offers. This led the Italian Competition Authority to sanction, and this sanction has been confirmed by the two courts that in Italy look at this behavior. So first TAR del Lazio, and subsequently a few months ago by State Council, which is the Supreme Court that decides on these kind of cases. And both in terms of the size of the fines and in terms of the kind of reasoning in the sentence that fully buys the argument in which you need to have an economic story that explains the overall behavior of the firm, this kind was very successful. 1 minute. Okay. So this is exactly what you call collusion. So screening by auction formats, there are features that can be exploited of the auction formats. Here, an effort needs to be made to link the law with the economics. That is, if you read the public procurement regulations, the European one or the national ones, they never speak the same language of economics. So if tests are developed by economists, they will speak about auction formats, but there is nothing like that in the regulation. In the regulation, typically, you hear about procedures and criteria. So procedure can be an open call or a negotiation, and criteria can be price or the most economically advantageous tender. Economics does not have the same language. It speaks about auction formats, which typically is the combination of a procedure and a criteria. So once this mapping is done, then you can exploit a very broad set of indicators that economics literature has constructed to detect collusion in different auction formats. Here are just a couple of examples. In the context of first price auction, there is a phenomenon called missing bid, which is a gap between the bid of the winner and the second bidder relative to the bid of all the other players, the second and the third and the fourth. This phenomenon has been documented in a number of cases. The Swiss Competition Authority, in the case that they start and won, started exactly from that kind of test. And the theoretical foundation for why this is a typical behavior of cartels is present in this recent paper by Chassang and co-authors. In the context of average bid auctions that are often used in public procurement, which are auctions in which the winner is not the lowest price, but is the firm pricing closest to some function of the average. These are also called endogenous scoring or abnormally low tender formats. Here there is an incentive for the firms to manipulate, because since it's not the lowest price, but is a function of the average, and the average can be pushed by multiple bids, then there is an incentive to coordinate. And indeed, using data from an Italian case, we have constructed and validated tests for the coordination of bids and the coordination of entry that then were able to replicate a court decision that convicted in Italy about 90 firms for collusion in that kind of auctions, and then was also used to try to detect cartels in a broader set of auctions where there was no cartel known before. And with this I conclude. I let you read the conclusion, otherwise Piero will kill me. But essentially, this test can work, but must be applied with a lot of care, especially because there is no single test and automatism really doesn't work. Some knowledge of the market is a precondition to apply this test.